Hey, good day, everyone. My report will be about English for specific purposes. So, the contents of my report will include what is ESP and course design. So, right now we're going to go into part one, what is ESP, the origins of ESP, the development of ESP, and the ELD tree. So, let's head on. What is ESP and the origins of ESP? So, ESP was not a planned movement. Rather, it grew out of several converging trends. And here we name three: the demands of the new world, revolution in linguistics, and focus on the learner. So these three factors seem to point towards the need for increased specialization in language learning. So the demands of the new world happened at the end of World War II, and this expanded the growth of technology and commerce, which eventually led to the need for an international language. And thus, English became the language of technology and commerce. And this created a new generation of learners, such as business people, mechanics, doctors, etc., who knew why they needed to learn the language. The next trend is revolution in linguistics. So, from the traditional aim of studying the formal features of language, there became a shift into studying instead the use of language in real communication. So this led to the assumption that English for one area of expertise is different from another area of expertise. So this is where we can apply the quote, "Tell me what you need English for, and I will tell you what English you need." So this became the guiding principle of ESP at that time. The third trend, we have focus on the learner. So because there were some developments in educational psychology, this led to the view that learners have different needs, different interests, and motivations for learning. This is where the term relevance came into light. So, the more relevant the English course is to the learner's needs, the more effective the learning. So, these courses were taught through taking texts from their areas of specialization and incorporating these texts into the lessons. Now, let's head on to the development of ESP. One area has been particularly pivotal to the development of ESP, and this area is called English for Science and Technology, or EST. So from the 1960s, there have been three phases of development, and is now in its fourth phase, and there is a fifth phase coming on the way. So phase one is register analysis, phase two is rhetorical or discourse analysis, phase three is target situation analysis, phase 4 is skills and strategies, and phase 5 is the learning-centered approach. So let's head on to the first phase, register analysis, or special language form. Proponents here are Peter Strevens, Jack Ewer, and John Swales. In here, the English of one area of work constituted a specific register, and this specific register is different from the others. And the aim of the analysis is to identify grammatical and lexical features of these registers. The aim of ESP at that time was to produce a syllabus which gave high priority to the language forms that students would meet in their science studies. So phase 2 is rhetorical or discourse analysis. So proponents are Henry Widowson, Larry Silinker, Louis Trumbull, John Lackstrom, and Mary Todd Trimble. So this phase believed that difficulties that students encounter in English was not because they're unfamiliar with the language system, but because they're unfamiliar with language use. The courses in ESP shifted from register analysis into how sentences were combined in discourse. So the concern of research at that time was on organizational patterns in text, and in ESP that time, text diagramming exercises were mostly used. So the next phase, we have target situation analysis. So the main proponents here are John Munby and F. Chambers. So this phase aimed to establish procedures for relating language analysis more closely to why the learners needed to learn English. So of course, learners' needs were placed at the center of syllabus design. So the ESP process of course design at that time proceeded by first identifying the target situation, and then analyzing the linguistic features needed for that situation. Here, the John Munby's communicative syllabus design model was used. So here, Munby introduced the Communication Needs Processor, or CNP, and later we will touch on that. Next is the skills and strategies approach. The proponents are Francois Grellet, Christine Nuttall, Charles Alderson, and Sandy Urquhart. So this phase aimed to look below the surface and to consider not the language itself, but the thinking processes that underlie language. So this phase says that underlying all language use there are common reasoning and interpreting processes, which regardless of surface forms enable us to make meaning out of discourse. So the focus, according to ESP at that time, should be on strategies that enable learners to cope with surface forms. For example, guessing meanings of words from context, using visual layout to determine the type of text, and usually just reading and listening strategies. Next, we have the learning-centered approach by Tom Hutchinson and Alan Waters. So, according to this view, the learning of English in the stages that were outlined so far have been flawed because they were all based on descriptions of language use. A truly valid approach to ESP must not be based on language use. Instead, it must be based on the understanding of the process of language learning. Now let's head on to the English language teaching tree. So the foundation of all language teaching is learning and communication. So in the picture, ESP is under EFL, or English as a foreign language. ESP is also opposed to general English, which is usually taught for exam purposes. Thus, the first conclusion that we can draw here is that ESP is teaching English for any other purposes, for example, work or study. These two are usually called English for occupational purposes or English for academic purposes. So according to this division, most secondary schools use general English, while universities and colleges all deal with ESP. Now let's proceed to what ESP is not. So ESP is not about teaching specialized varieties of English because there are no specialized varieties of English. Instead, there are only different ways of using English. So ESP is not just a matter of science words and grammar for scientists, hotel words, or engineering words. We need to distinguish, as Chomsky did with regard to grammar, between performance and competence. That is, between what people actually do with the language and the range of knowledge and abilities. Next, ESP is not different from any other form of language teaching because there is no such thing as an ESP methodology, merely methodologies that have been applied in the ESP classroom. So now let's head on to the absolute characteristics of ESP is defined to meet specific needs of the learners. ESP makes use of underlying methodology and activities of the discipline it serves, and ESP is centered on the language appropriate to these activities in terms of grammar, lexis, register, study skills, and discourse and genre. Now for the variable characteristics of ESP. So ESP may be related to or designed for specific disciplines. So variable, we mean it is not exact or it's not necessarily true all the time. So second is ESP may use a different methodology from that of general English, or it could also use the same methodologies. Next, ESP is likely to be designed for adult learners, but sometimes it can also be for secondary school learners. Next, ESP is generally designed for intermediate or advanced students. So this is not the true all the time because ESP can also be taught to those with basic knowledge only. Next, most ESP courses assume some basic knowledge of the language systems, but it can also be used with beginners. Now let's head on to the ESP learner. So the ESP learner brings to the table three features. So we have focus for learning, subject matter knowledge, and adult learning strategies. So the learner's main task is developing English language skills to be in the same level as their native language knowledge and skills. So for the focus of learning, the ESP student has a particular purpose and focus for learning because people learn languages when they have opportunities to understand and work with language in a context that they comprehend and find interesting. So successful learners pay attention to the meaning of the language that they hear or read, and they do not primarily only focus on the linguistic input or isolated language structures. Next, we have subject matter knowledge. So learners in the ESP classroom are able to make a real contribution to the language learning process. This is because they're already oriented about their training toward a specific field. So they see English instruction as helpful or complementary to this work orientation. So when they already have knowledge of their specialty areas, this enables them to identify a context for the vocabulary and the structures that they are to learn in the ESP classroom. So in this way, they can take advantage of what they already know about the subject matter in order to learn English better. Next, we have adult learning strategies. So learning as an adult always has its advantages. So adults must actually learn harder than children because they're learning, not simply acquiring. but the learning strategies that they bring to the task enables them to learn faster and more efficiently. So the skills that they bring, they have already developed this in reading and writing in their native languages, and this will make them learn language faster and more efficient. Now let's proceed to the ESP teacher, or you. So you actually have 4 goals. So first is organizing programs. You will be the one to set the goals for students and then translate these goals to an instructional program with hourly, daily, and weekly activities. Next, setting goals and objectives. So you will be arranging the conditions for learning in the classroom and setting long-term goals and short-term objectives for the achievement of your students. Next is establishing a learning environment. So your communication skills will establish the classroom atmosphere. So language is acquired by students when they have opportunities to use the language in interaction with other speakers. So in this way, you will actually be the model for communication. So you must be having a native ability, almost native-like ability in the English language. Finally, your last role is evaluating students. So you are a resource person who helps students identify their language learning problems, and you have to help them find a solution to these problems. Now let's go to the classifications of ESP. So ESP has 2 main branches. On the left, we have English for academic purposes, and on the right, we have English for occupational purposes. So EAP on the left has English for science and technology, English for medical purposes, English for legal purposes, English for management, finance, and economics. And for English for occupational purposes, we have English for professional purposes and English for vocational purposes. So EPP, or English for professional purposes, has English for medical purposes and English for business purposes. So EVP has English for pre-vocational English and English for vocational English. So now we must differentiate between real content and career content. So real content means pedagogical aims, such as the features of language that the learners will hopefully become more aware of at the end of the ESP course. So the career content, on the other hand, simply means the means or the way that you as a teacher deliver the content. And this includes the use of tasks and activities in your lessons. So finally, for the last topic of part 1, we have John Munby's needs analysis model. So the main aim of this model is to identify what the learner needs to know in order to function in the target situation. So here we have 7 spheres: the participant, the communication needs processor, the profile of needs, meaning processor, the language skill selector, linguistic encoder, and the communicative competence specification. So for the participants, this includes information about who the learners are, their age, sex, nationality, and etc. So for the CNP, or communication needs processor, we investigate the particular communication needs according to social, cultural, and stylistic variables which interact to determine a profile of needs. So the profile of needs, this is the results that we get from the CNP. Next, the meaning processor. So the meaning processor are parts of the socio-culturally determined profile of communication needs, and these are converted into semantic subcategories. Next, we have language skill selector. So this identifies the specific language skills that are required to realize the events or activities that have been identified by the CNP. Next, the linguistic encoder. This considers how appropriate the context is. And lastly, the communicative competence specification. So this is the final sphere which indicates the target communicative competence of the participant and is finally translated into a profile of needs for the learner. And that's it for part 1 of English for specific purposes.